Welcome to our new series, Family Life, where I want you to imagine, my friends, what we could do if we could be honest with God about things we pretend about. It's if we, together as families, would risk being candid and courageous about our family lives. Family can be a little messy sometimes. The easy things that I used to see at Target all the time, the kids bugging a mom or dad about a favorite toy or that they want, or maybe some place they want to go, or when they get in the check lanes, there's all the candy and the little things around there, or maybe they don't get the toy they want and the surprise ball or the Happy Meal or whatever, and they couldn't get the candy bar, because you said no, and suddenly the dreaded meltdown happens. It's like or the blow up, or the screaming, or something along those lines. I've seen a lot of different things in my time working at Target. One of my favorites was this little girl. She was about this tall, maybe, and somewhere in that area, and she said, "We're not leaving until I get this toy." And Mom's like, "Well, I'm leaving." And so she starts to walk towards the door, and the little girl, she plants her feet firmly apart like this, crosses her hands, and gives her mom the look. The kind of look that probably, moms and dads reserve for misbehaving children, And I have to say, it did not elicit the desired response that this little girl was hoping for. When you're only about this tall and you're giving the look like that, it doesn't really work. It kind of looked a little comical. So the mom kind of started laughing a little bit, and the little girl didn't like that. But imagine what God could do with family life. We're going to be diving into the life of David here, and we're going to broad stroke it today a little bit, just go through some different areas. But we're going to be talking today about getting candid and courageous. Candid and courageous. It's the only way that God can take us to fresh places, if we are honest with Him and get honest with each other. So, talking about being candid, we see how David was blessed by God. In the story of David, but then we also see how dysfunction and breakdown enter in, and everything gets messed up. The number one breakdown that broke the family relationship in David's life, obviously there was mistakes, there was sin, and the big thing that really messed things up was pretense. We've heard the phrase, there's an elephant in the room, let's address the elephant in the room. And even worse, sometimes when we don't address the elephant in the room, it becomes, we run the risk of just adopting it and letting it become the family pet. So, if you've never heard that phrase, the elephant in the room, I would imagine most of you have. It's been around for a while. An elephant is that big old thing that takes up space, and maybe it smells a little bit. It's impossible to ignore and get around, and we try to do it anyway because oftentimes the elephant is a sensitive topic that no one wants to face or talk about, or something that we don't want to, and something that's kind of a touchy subject, or, so we just kind of let it be, and it just it just affects everybody's lives in a negative way. I recently saw this asthma medication commercial, where there's supposedly this new company came out with some new wonder drug that was supposed to replace rescue inhalers with a better kind of inhaler, I guess. And they refer to the old albuterol inhaler as kind of a dinosaur. And so this guy was walking around, he had this big dinosaur, and this dinosaur had this big chain around its neck with his albuterol inhaler there. And he had to go everywhere he went. He had to take the dinosaur with him, so the dinosaur would be in the car with him, and it would bump him, and the guy would accidentally swerve a little bit. He was trying to get in the elevator, and he was trying to fit in there with the dinosaur, and he's trying to reach over and hit a button, and the dinosaur's tail like whacks all the buttons, and and eventually, at the end, he gets the new medication, of course, and you see the dinosaur in a cab, and they just kind of wave at each other, goodbye, and whatever. But so it's kind of like that. I mean, these elephants, they take up space in our lives and our relationships. They cause stress, and sometimes when we fear to address them, we end up adopting them. They kind of like become the family pet. Y'all probably thought I was going to talk about dogs and cats today when you saw the sermon topic, but that's not what we're talking about. These aren't cute pets, unfortunately. But pretense, or when we start pretending that the problems we have, that the problems we bring into our relationships, or the problems that are in the family, we pretend they're not really there, and those belittling comments that we give to others or that others direct towards us, and those sniping that we have towards each other, that we pretend, there's nothing really behind it. We pretend that silence is normal, and that the cold shoulder routines are normal, and that walking on eggshells is good and normal. And then we say, oh, we're fine. Imagine the child drawing a little family portrait at school when there being a giant elephant in the place of a pet. Even sometimes the stress of going somewhere can be difficult. Even getting to church on Sundays. And when we suddenly arrive at church, we all just put on this little image that we want to project. We're all smiles. Everything is great. I watched this video once that was kind of went along with this series. I don't have it today to show you, but they were called the Find Family, and the video starts out with a mother and a boy and a girl sitting at a dinner table, waiting for the food, and then there's also this elephant sitting at the table, and it's obviously a guy in an elephant costume, but the elephant is just making a mess. He's just knocking things over, he's just throwing things around the room, and then the dad comes in wearing a suit with a bucket of KFC chicken, and even before he gets the chicken on the table, the elephant is digging through the chicken, taking pieces out, throwing it right, left, over his head, all things, just making a horrible mess, and nobody is paying any attention to it. Everybody is just ignoring it and, pretending like everything's perfectly normal. And the dad finally gets the chicken set down on the table, and some of the other family members grab some and they start eating. And in the meantime, the elephant knocks over the milk. There's milk all over the table. There's mashed potatoes and other things all over the table. And the family's just talking like everything's perfectly normal, and ignoring the elephant in the room. And the elephant chucks something at the dad's head, and it hits the dad right in the forehead, and the dad just pretends nothing happened. And then we see little snipes going between him and his wife. I wish you were here more to take care of the things around the house. And the husband says, I wish you would cook a meal every once in a while so that I wouldn't have to go pick up takeout every day after my hard day at work. And they even snipe at the kids a little bit. The daughter calls the brother stupid, and the mother just kind of barely addresses it, and the dad says something like, well, son, it's a good thing you're so athletic, you don't have to be smart. And I'm like, sheesh. And I'm just watching this, and the whole time the elephant's still making a mess. Nobody's paying attention to it. And the elephant gets up from the table, walks over to the cupboard, gets out some peanuts and some Dr. Pepper, and goes over to the couch. And he proceeds to start throwing peanuts everywhere and spilling Dr. Pepper everywhere. And nobody's paying attention to any of these things. It's all just going on. And eventually the elephant lets out a big fart, and then the mother immediately starts lighting scented candles, and the daughter says, "What's that smell?" And, "Oh, I don't smell anything," Shh, and they leave. They're going to soccer practice or whatever, and then they encounter a maid, and they're like, "Oh, we're so glad that you're here to take care of, just help out a little bit, and should just be a little bit of light dusting, no big deal." And the maid's like, "Yeah, right," so then the family leaves. The maid walks in and, and sticks their head back out and says, "Hey, get the turbo vacuum," and she puts on a gas mask, and we see her go back into the house. And this is, of course, an extreme example, of what can go on, but sometimes we all try to look better than we actually live. And David made the mistake of letting elephants and pretense into the family, and they even worse, he kind of adopted it, and he's not alone. I mean, there can be big problems when we try to ignore the elephant in the room. It can make a big mess. And even worse, when we make the elephant, when we just kind of adopt it because we don't want to deal with it. See, and this was David's failure. I mean, he was a man after God's own heart. Few men knew the depth of God's tangible favor like David did, and his prevailing presence like David did. But when we look on the inside of his life, and he takes the risk of letting elephants in and pretense with God, I mean, terrible things happen. As we look at David's journey, as I said, we're going to kind of broad stroke it today. And in Samuel 7, it says in verses 8 through 9, I'm just going to read it quickly. It says, "I took you from the pasture, from the tending of the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone. I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth." And David, he had quite the military career. I mean, he defeats the Philistines, the Moabites. He defeats Rahab, the king of Zobah, capturing thousands of soldiers. He also, when that happens, another king from Damascus comes to try to help this other king, and he defeats thousands of their soldiers, and he defeats another army, and many of these places become tributaries to David. And so he was a shepherd, he was a soldier, he was a hero, and he was a king. All of those things. And friends, as I talk about families, I want to make one thing clear before we go forward. I'm not just talking about family relationships with children, in the house. I'm talking about our relationships, even when our children are grown, or even within our extended families as well. I mean, we all have to deal with those elephants, whether we got a family with kids, or whether our kids are growing up, or whether we have conflict between even, sisters, siblings, whatever, So David was many things, and David didn't keep all of these treasures. It says in chapter 8, it says, in 11, David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued, Edom and Moab and Ammonites and the Philistines and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hanazar, son of Rohab. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but he recognized that God is the giver of these good things. And in verses 13 and 14 it says, "And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went." God's favor was with David. And in these 4 seasons of David's life, we find this amazing favor in his life and in his family. And then enters the moment where he decides to pretend with God. We all know what he did. We've talked about it several times here. And we'll probably talk about it more in these next coming weeks. But he decides to pretend that none of this stuff happened. Maybe we've all done that. We pretend we don't see what's going on. We pretend we don't recognize sin in our life, and we think maybe God isn't seeing it either. But as we look at chapter 12, verse 9, the prophet says to David, "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes?" Well, David did some terrible things. And even worse, he tried to cover it up by pretending that it didn't happen. Making the elephant in the room a family pet, so to speak. And you see, when we do that with God, when we do that with our marriages, when we do that in our family relationships, even our regular friendships, when we pretend these real issues that occur, that they don't exist, it brings destruction. And that destruction can be tremendous. Pretense can kill family life. And we'll talk more about it later. I heard this story once that a pastor shared how when his mother died, the father changed. He changed from a Christian man to one that would go to church every Sunday, that even taught Sunday school, to someone who 40 years later had no relationship with his son and had never even met his grandchildren. The pastor told the story how he was back in town. He wasn't planning on seeing his dad at all, and they were at some steak restaurant, and he and his wife were coming out of a restroom, and they bumped into this gentleman and another woman, and he realized, he looks up and he goes, "Oh, hello, Father." He had no idea he was even going to be there. It was awkward, and his father had no desire to even talk to him. And this pastor tells this story about how his 6-year-old son asked him once, "Why don't you have a daddy? Is he dead like your mom?" And he says, How do I tell a 6-year-old that my dad lied and my dad, that my dad left? I mean, how do you tell a 6-year-old that my dad was a churchgoer, a Sunday school teacher, and then, he brought in elephants and his own pain and what that he wasn't dealing with, and those elephants and the pretense just kind of killed the family? I mean, how do you tell a 6-year-old that? And how do you tell a 6-year-old that, if my dad would have been, 60 years ago, if my dad would have been sitting in church and heard a sermon like that, he would have agreed that pretense killed a family and that letting elephants in the room would kill a family, but yet he did all of these things, and he would have said, "We're good." And 40 years later, you run into your son and you have no relationship. Pretense killed my family, he said. I mean, imagine telling David at any point of his life, telling David, "Hey, David, at some moment, where you're a man after God's own heart, if you will have a pretentious moment with God, you will do something, you'll try to pretend it didn't happen, and you'll have an elephant in the room that you won't address, and it will carry into your family and your family relationships, your children, and to your children, and your daughter will feel like that, that you died until eventually one of your sons kills another, and the son you love dies as well, and later in life you'll cry out to God saying, 'I wish that I was dead instead of my son.'" He would say, "Well, that's never going to happen. I would never let that happen." Pretense kills families. I can't imagine not having a relationship with my parents. My parents are getting older, and someday, they will pass on from this earth, and I will have to deal with that temporary separation at that time. I can't imagine what it'll feel like, but I will be able to hold on to the relationship that I had with my family, with my parents. I can't imagine what it would be like for my parents to be alive yet dead to me. My friends, I don't take family relationships lightly because it is indeed a weighty matter. Pretense can wreck family life, but it doesn't have to be that way. I'm going to confess something. I had my own version of pretense as I was a kid growing up. When I was very young, obviously, I had a wonderful relationship with my maternal grandmother on my mom's grandmother. She would often babysit for me, and I would go over to her house. I loved Grandma's house. I loved Grandma's crackers, which I didn't realize were actually called graham crackers until preschool. But as I got older, my priorities shifted. I didn't need a babysitter anymore. I started hanging out with friends more than I did with family, and all of a sudden, I didn't see my grandma as much anymore, and I thought, well, Grandma's always going to be there, I can see her later. When I was in high school, my sophomore year, she was in the hospital, and I thought, well, she's been in the hospital before, it's no big deal. And the last time I saw my grandmother, it was, that usual light and spark in her eyes, it was gone. It was like it was looking at a different person. And shortly after that, she passed away, and I was a little shocked by that. That was my first experience with a death that was close to me, someone that was close to me, but it didn't really change me much. About a year or so later, my father's father passed on, and I never really had much of a relationship with him. He wasn't too interested in the kids. He would watch us and delight in us a little bit, but didn't live as close by. So, and then a year or two later, my maternal grandfather passed away, and suddenly I realized I only have one grandparent left. All of this pretense I'd had about my grandparents being there forever, it just kind of fell apart. And I realized I basically didn't really have a relationship with my father's mother. It was the same kind of thing. She wasn't around much, but when I was young, and by the time I'd gotten older and she had moved closer, I didn't really have that much of a relationship. And finally, it shocked me into action. I said to myself, this is my last grandparent. I want to have a relationship with her, and I did. It was wonderful. We got closer, we talked a lot, and I wish I would have made that time with my other grandparents. And I wish that it wouldn't have taken all three of my other grandparents to make me realize how important that relationship was. We never know how much time we're going to have. If there's family estrangement, if there's family tension, that was something that this COVID pandemic taught me, is that we really just don't know how much time we have. We need to treasure it all the time we can. We got to deal with those elephants. We got to get rid of whatever it is that's keeping us apart. Because, my friends, it doesn't have to be this way. If there is estrangement, if there is tension, God can bring healing. We have to learn to be courageous. We have to learn to live in an elephant-free family. And that doesn't mean that problems won't exist. I mean, families that are healthy, they acknowledge these problems and then they deal with the elephant, and then the elephant has to leave. The elephant isn't in the room anymore when we deal with the elephant. So here's where we're going to go with this series. We're going to be talking over the next several weeks. We're going to talk about belittling and belonging. You know, those two things don't go together. They're polar opposites. You know, do we make others in our families more or less? And we're going to be talking about, do we know how to blend affection and discipline? That'll be a little bit more for parents. Do we know how to raise one-time kids, or is that breaking down? Do we even know what I mean by one-time kids? You know, grandparents, we're in this too. You're in this too as well. We're all raising those kids, and as well as even community members like myself. We're also going to be talking about the elephant of over-expecting and the dissatisfaction in marriages. Pastor once said that a marriage is not an amusement park, and you don't want it to be. Because think about it, that might be a cultural perspective, but when you're going on the rides last a few minutes, and sometimes the lines take hours. We're going to be talking about inflicting conflict and re-inflicting. We're going to be talking about the elephant of family foolishness and how it can make just a stinky mess. And we're going to talk about how to stunt a family in the denial of dependence. That's our next several weeks right there. And so friends, as we end today, I'm going to ask, how can we confess our own elephants? And this isn't a time to look at our spouse, or our kids or whatever. We're all really good at looking at others and saying, no, if you would just deal with this. Now, if you would just, it's if we point out all of our flaws, it takes the pressure off of ourselves, right? We have to be willing to ask for the do-over. We have to say, you know what, I'm sorry. I brought the elephant in today with my behaviors and my attitude and whatever, and it may take me a little while to get through this. Please give me patience. And then the elephant has to leave because we can deal with the issues. And we also have to be people that give the do-overs. And we have to confess our own elephants, because when there's elephants going on, oftentimes we all start bringing our own elephants. It's not a quick fix. This is a Get Fit series. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for the start of this new series, and I'm just grateful for what it's going to bring. Sometimes things are hard to talk about. Help us to have the courage to be candid and the courage to be courageous. Help us to be a generation of people that are reconcilers, that heal and don't divide. Help us to be peacemakers that you've called us to be. Lord, we all have our own elephants that we bring in. Help us to just confess those things so that we can deal with those things. Help us to all have it. And don't let us adopt that elephant and make it a family pet. Thank you, Lord, for what you're going to teach us in this series. In your name we pray. Amen.